Dr. Anaya Patel, a world-renowned heart surgeon, had just delivered the most important speech of her career, only to be publicly humiliated at the airport. She paid for her first-class seat, yet the airline denied her boarding, shuffling her aside like she didn't belong. The kicker, a white businessman, waltzed right in without question, but Dr. Patel wasn't about to stay silent. With 7 powerful words, she ignited a firestorm that sent the entire airline industry into chaos, one they'd never forget. Before we start, buckle up, get ready, and subscribe, because tomorrow I've got a special surprise just for you. Dr. Anaya Patel stood at the podium, her voice steady, her presence commanding. The bright lights of the conference hall cast a warm glow on her as she concluded her keynote address, her words resonating through the packed auditorium. She had just delivered a groundbreaking presentation on a new, minimally invasive cardiac procedure, one that could save thousands of lives. The applause was thunderous, a mix of admiration and respect, as her colleagues, researchers, and journalists rose to their feet. As she stepped off the stage, a well-dressed medical journalist approached her beaming. "Dr. Patel, that was extraordinary. The implications of your research could be monumental. I'd love to feature your work in the Journal of Cardiothoracic Advances." Anaya smiled graciously, still riding the adrenaline high of the moment. "I'd be honored," she replied. "Let's set up a time to discuss further." The conference had been a success, an affirmation of the years she had dedicated to her field. This was what she had worked for: long nights, relentless studies, breaking through the limitations placed on her as both a woman and a person of color in a world that had long underestimated her. Now, she was at the top of her game, earning the recognition she deserved. Her flight home was already booked, first class, a well-earned luxury after back-to-back panels, networking events, and media requests. She longed to stretch out, sip a glass of wine, and relax as she soared through the sky, heading home to her patients, her hospital, and the life she had built through sheer determination. At the airport, she moved through security with practiced ease, dressed in a sleek but professional outfit, her rolling carry-on gliding beside her. The airport buzzed with the usual cacophony of departure announcements and hurried footsteps, a mix of weary travelers and vacationers rushing to their gates. She reached the check-in counter, handing over her passport and first-class ticket to the airline agent. The woman behind the desk glanced at her, then at the ticket, her lips pressing into a thin line. A flicker of something, hesitation, doubt, flashed across her face. "Dr. Patel," the agent said, her voice polite but clipped. "Just one moment, please." Anaya arched an eyebrow but said nothing. The agent tapped furiously on her keyboard, her expression shifting from neutral to something more calculated. After a moment, she forced a smile. "It looks like there's been a slight issue with your seat assignment. You'll need to speak with the gate agent before boarding." Anaya frowned. "Issue? Nothing serious," the woman replied too quickly. "Just a minor overbooking situation. They'll assist you at the gate." Anaya had traveled too often to believe in coincidences like this. Still, she nodded, taking back her ticket and making her way to the gate, an unsettling feeling creeping into her chest. She dismissed it. Surely it was nothing. After all, she had booked this seat months ago. She had earned it as Dr. Anaya. Patel made her way through the terminal. The uneasy feeling in her gut deepened. She had traveled too many times to ignore the subtle cues, the hesitancy in the check-in agent's voice, the way she had glanced at Anaya's ticket as if it didn't belong in her hands, the almost rehearsed explanation about an overbooking situation. She clenched her jaw but kept her posture composed. She wasn't going to jump to conclusions. Not yet. The first-class lounge was filled with the quiet murmur of business travelers tapping away on laptops, sipping complimentary drinks as they waited to board. Anaya took a seat near the window, gazing out at the runway where planes taxied under the golden glow of the late afternoon sun. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through emails while she waited, her mind still half-focused on the lingering suspicion that something was off. Around her, The usual airport patterns played out. A young flight attendant in a pressed navy uniform smiled warmly as she poured champagne for an older white couple in tailored suits. A businessman in an expensive watch and leather briefcase strode confidently to the gate without anyone stopping him to verify his seat. Anaya noticed these things, not because she was looking for them, but because she had lived them too many times. Called for first-class boarding. She rose and walked toward the counter, her ticket in hand. The agent, a tall man with a stiff expression, barely glanced at her before shaking his head. "Dr. Patel?" he asked, scanning his screen. "Yes," she said, handing over her boarding pass. "I'm afraid there's been a seating adjustment. First class is overbooked, and we need to move you to economy for this flight." The words landed like a slap. Anaya blinked, her grip tightening on the handle of her carry-on. "That's not acceptable," she said, keeping her voice even. "I booked this seat months ago. It was confirmed. I have a first-class ticket in my hand." The agent barely looked at her as he replied, "Yes, well, due to unforeseen circumstances, we had to make some adjustments. Economy is still available, and we can offer you a meal voucher for the inconvenience." Meal voucher, as if that was an equal exchange. Anaya's pulse quickened, but her expression remained unreadable. She took a deep breath. "Who exactly was reassigned to my seat?" she asked. The agent hesitated. I don't have that information on hand." A few feet away, she caught sight of a middle-aged white man in a crisp navy suit, boarding pass in hand, strolling through the first-class lane with no issue. She had seen him in the lounge earlier, arriving after her. The pieces clicked into place. Anaya's voice was firm now. "This isn't an overbooking issue, is it?" The agent's jaw tensed. "Ma'am, I need you to step aside so we can continue boarding." A few passengers glanced over, sensing the tension, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to deliberate indifference. Anaya Patel had spent years breaking down barriers in medicine, proving her worth over and over again. She wasn't about to let a gate agent erase her like she didn't belong. She straightened her shoulders, her voice unwavering as she met his gaze. "I belong here. You will remember this." The words hung in the air, sharp and unwavering. For a brief moment, there was silence, just the quiet hum of the airport intercom and the distant chatter of other passengers boarding without issue. The gate agent's expression flickered, a flash of uncertainty crossing his face before he quickly masked it with indifference. "Ma'am," he said again, this time with forced patience, "I need you to step aside." Anaya didn't move. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the years of microaggressions, of assumptions that she was a nurse rather than a surgeon, of people doubting she belonged in the spaces she had fought so hard to reach. But this was different. This wasn't subtle. This was blatant. A young woman standing a few feet away lifted her phone slightly, angling the camera toward the interaction. Another passenger, a middle-aged black man in a grey blazer, watched from the first-class line, his brow furrowing. "Excuse me," Anaya said, her voice calm but firm. "I paid for this seat. I checked in with this ticket. Now you're telling me that despite confirming my first-class seat, I've been adjusted out of it? But that man," she gestured subtly toward the businessman in the navy suit, now settling into his seat, "had no issue taking his?" The agent stiffened. "I can't discuss other passengers' bookings." "Then discuss mine," she shot back. "Because, right now, you're not giving me a valid reason why I'm being removed, and I won't be moved unless you do." A murmur rippled through the nearby crowd. The young woman with the phone was still recording, her fingers barely moving as she discreetly zoomed in. The gate agent noticed, his eyes flickering to the camera before quickly looking away. "Ma'am," he tried again, his voice lowering, "if you refuse to cooperate, I'll have to call security." "Call them," Anaya said without hesitation. "And while you're at it, make sure they know they're about to forcibly remove a board-certified cardiac surgeon from a seat she legally purchased because your airline decided to make a last-minute adjustment." That did it. A ripple of surprise crossed the agent's face, and a couple of nearby passengers whispered amongst themselves. The businessman in the navy suit even glanced up from his phone, suddenly interested in the commotion. The tension thickened. The agent shifted on his feet, his fingers tapping against the counter. Anaya could see it now, the hesitation, the silent debate playing out behind his guarded expression. This wasn't company policy. This was bias. He knew it. And now, so, did everyone watching. "You need to make this right," she said, her voice quieter but no less powerful. "Because I'm not moving, and if you think I'm the only one paying attention, you're mistaken." The agent exhaled sharply. He turned, muttering something to a colleague. A pause, a brief conversation. Then finally he looked back at her, jaw tight. "Wait here." And just like that, the balance of power away, whispering furiously into his radio. His back turned, as if shielding himself from the growing audience. Anaya stood tall, her pulse steady, her mind sharp. She was no stranger to confrontation, but this was different. This wasn't a miscommunication or an oversight. This was an erasure, an attempt to push her aside, to make her invisible in a space she had every right to occupy. Passengers were watching now, some subtly, others more openly. The young woman with the phone was still recording, her gaze darting between Anaya and the agent. A few feet away, a couple muttered to each other, their expressions unreadable. The businessman in the navy suit, the one who had so easily walked into first class, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing over as if suddenly aware of the weight of his own presence. A uniformed airline supervisor arrived, her expression carefully neutral. She spoke briefly with the gate agent before turning to Anaya. "Dr. Patel," she said smoothly, as if trying to reset the tone of the conversation. "I understand there's been a misunderstanding regarding your seat." Anaya crossed her arms. "There's no misunderstanding. I booked this seat months ago. I checked in without issue. And yet, I was told my seat had been adjusted, while other passengers walked into first class without a problem." The supervisor maintained a polite smile, but Anaya saw the discomfort behind it. "Unfortunately, due to an internal reallocation, we had to make some last-minute seating changes. We sincerely apologize for the inconvenience, but we're happy to accommodate you in economy." Anaya let out a slow breath, keeping her composure. "A meal voucher and an economy seat are not an equal exchange for what I paid for. More importantly, I want to know why I was reassigned while others weren't." The supervisor's smile faltered for half a second before she forced it back into place. "I assure you, our process is completely unbiased." Anaya arched a brow. "Then show me." "The process." Silence. The supervisor hesitated, her carefully rehearsed corporate response momentarily faltering. The gate agent shifted beside her, his posture stiff. They weren't expecting pushback. They weren't expecting her to stand her ground. More. Murmurs from the crowd. A middle-aged black man near the front of the line spoke up. "She's right. I fly first class all the time, and I've never seen a random reassignment like this." The young woman with the phone nodded, her voice clear. "I got all of this on video, just so you know." That changed things. The supervisor's eyes flickered to the phone, her lips pressing into a thin line. She exhaled sharply, turning to the gate agent. "Get her seat back." The words were clipped, resigned. The gate agent's jaw tightened, but he obeyed, tapping furiously on his computer. A few moments later, he looked up, barely concealing his frustration. "Your seat is reinstated, Dr. Patel." Anaya took her boarding pass, her expression unreadable. She didn't thank them. They didn't deserve it. Instead, she met the supervisor's gaze, her voice quiet but firm. "You will remember this." Then she turned, rolling her carry-on behind her, and stepped into first class, where she had always belonged. Dr. Anaya Patel settled into her first-class seat, her back straight, her hands resting on the armrests with an air of quiet defiance. She wasn't naive enough to think the issue was over. The gate agents had relented, but only because they had been forced to. If no one had been watching, if no cameras had been recording, she knew she would have been shoved into economy without a second thought. The businessman in the navy suit a few rows ahead glanced at her, then quickly looked away. A flight attendant approached, her smile professional but strained. "Dr. Patel, can I get you something to drink?" Anaya met her gaze, searching for any trace of condescension or discomfort. The woman seemed neutral, maybe even sympathetic, but Anaya had no appetite for pleasantries. "Just water," she said. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin, the plane began its taxi to the runway. Anaya exhaled slowly, trying to shake the tension coiled inside her chest. She had dealt with bias her entire career, but something about the ease with which they had tried to erase her, as if she had no right to question it, felt heavier. Her phone vibrated. A text from her colleague, Dr. Jameson, popped up. "Saw the video. Are you okay?" Anaya's brows furrowed. "What video?" Before Jameson could reply, another text came in, this time from her cousin in New York. "You're trending. Holy shit." Her stomach tightened. She switched to social media, and the first thing she saw was her own face frozen mid-sentence in a video with the caption, "Black surgeon denied first-class seat. Her response shakes the airline industry." The video had already amassed over 1 million views. The comments were flooded. "I'm so glad she stood her ground. She paid for that seat. How do airlines still get away with this? Imagine being a literal world-class surgeon and still being treated like you don't belong." Dozens of verified accounts, activists, journalists, even a few celebrities had already retweeted the video, demanding accountability from the airline. Some were calling for boycotts. Others were sharing their own horror stories of racial discrimination. While traveling, Anaya's pulse quickened as she scrolled. She hadn't even been in the air for 10 minutes, and already the world knew what had happened. A flight attendant passed by, discreetly glancing at her phone screen. So they had seen it too. The tension in the cabin was palpable now, like everyone was waiting for something to happen. Anaya turned off her phone and stared out the window, her reflection staring back at her. She hadn't intended to make a statement. She had only demanded what was hers, but now it was bigger than her, and somewhere in a corporate boardroom she knew the airline executives were scrambling because they had just picked the wrong woman. To silence. The airline boardroom was silent, except for the rhythmic clicking of a nervous executive's pen. The crisis team sat around a long, polished table, their faces tight with tension as they stared at the massive screen at the front of the room. A paused video clip showed Dr. Anaya Patel standing firm at the boarding gate, her eyes locked with the gate agents, her words echoing through the speakers. "I belong here. You will remember this." A senior executive cleared his throat. "How bad is it?" A woman from PR, her face pale, adjusted her glasses and tapped her laptop. "The video has 4.2 million views in the last 3 hours. It's on every major platform, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. News outlets have picked it up. We're talking CNN, BBC, the New York Times, even celebrities are commenting on it." The CEO, a heavy-set man in his 50s, exhaled sharply and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Damn it! How the hell did this happen?" A younger executive, clearly out of his depth, hesitated before speaking. It looks bad," he admitted. "I mean, it's not just the video. People are digging into past complaints about discrimination from our airline. They're posting screenshots of other passengers who had similar experiences. There's even an old lawsuit resurfacing from 3 years ago." The CEO's scowl deepened. "What's the damage?" A financial analyst at the end of the table clicked through a few reports. "Our stock is already down 4.7%, and we expect it to drop further when markets open tomorrow. We're also getting major corporate travel accounts questioning their contracts with us." The room tensed. Losing corporate accounts meant losing millions. The PR director leaned forward. "We need to release a statement immediately." The CEO nodded. "Fine, something neutral. Apologize for the inconvenience, say we take these matters seriously and that we're conducting an internal review." The PR director hesitated. "Sir, with all due respect, a generic statement won't work this time. People don't want platitudes. They want accountability." The CEO's expression darkened. "We're not admitting wrongdoing. If we do, we open ourselves up to legal action." A younger woman, a junior analyst who had been silent until now, spoke up hesitantly. "Sir, respectfully, We're past the point of controlling the narrative. Dr. Patel isn't just some random passenger. She's a world-renowned surgeon. If we don't take real action, we risk this turning into a full-scale boycott." The room fell silent. Finally, the CEO exhaled, rubbing his temples. "Fine. Set up a meeting with legal. We need to contain this before it gets any worse." But outside those walls, it was already too late. The world wasn't waiting for an internal review. The world had seen what happened, and the world was demanding justice. Dr. Anaya Patel stepped off the plane into a whirlwind. She barely had time to collect her luggage before her phone started buzzing again. Texts, missed calls, notifications piling up like an avalanche. She ignored them for now. All she wanted was to get home, take a long shower, and put the entire flight behind her. But the world wasn't going to let her move on so easily. As she reached the airport exit, she noticed something unusual. People were staring. A few whispered to each other. Others openly took photos. Then she saw it. Her own face on a news broadcast, playing on a nearby screen. The headline scrolled across the bottom. "Top surgeon denied first-class seat sparks airline scandal." She felt her stomach tighten. It wasn't just trending. It was everywhere. Dr. Patel. She turned to find a young reporter approaching, microphone in hand, a cameraman following close behind. "Would you be willing to make a statement about what happened?" She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't wanted to be the face of another viral controversy. She just wanted what was hers, what she had paid for, what she had earned. But now, the moment was bigger than her. "No comment," she said, shaking her head and walking past. But even as she left the airport, she knew it was only a matter of time before she would have to say something. By the time she reached her apartment, exhaustion clung to her like a second skin. She dropped her bag by the door, kicked off her shoes, and collapsed onto the couch. She finally checked her phone. Dozens of texts from colleagues, family, friends. One stood out. "Dr. Jameson, you should speak. This is bigger than you. You can make a difference." She stared at the message. Make a difference. Wasn't that what she had dedicated her life to? But she was a surgeon, not an activist. She fixed hearts. She wasn't here to fix corporate America. Her phone buzzed again. Another. News alert. The airline had finally issued a statement. "We take all allegations of discrimination seriously. We are reviewing our internal policies and will conduct a full investigation into this matter." The usual PR script. Empty words. No accountability. No apology. Anaya exhaled slowly. She could stay silent. Let the moment pass. Let the airline sweep this under the rug like they always did. Or she could speak. Her fingers hovered over her phone. Then before she could second-guess herself, she opened her email. Subject, interview request. She typed one line, "Let's talk." And then she hit send. The studio lights were blinding, but Dr. Anaya Patel sat composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap as the interview began. Across from her, the seasoned news anchor, Lisa Monroe, leaned forward, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Dr. Patel, thank you for being here today," Lisa said, offering a practiced but warm smile. Anaya nodded. "Thank you for having me." Lisa wasted no time. "The video of your experience has now reached over 10 million views, and the airline's statement has been widely criticized for being vague and insincere. People are calling for real accountability. Can you walk us through what happened that day?" Anaya took a measured breath. She had rehearsed this in her head a dozen times, but now, sitting here under the scrutiny of millions, it felt different, heavier. "I had just finished delivering a keynote speech at a medical conference," she began. "I booked a first-class ticket well in advance. I checked in like any other passenger. And yet when I arrived at the gate, I was told that my seat had been reassigned due to overbooking." Lisa nodded. "But you noticed something. This wasn't just a routine overbooking, was it?" Anaya's gaze was steady. "No, I watched as other passengers, mostly white men, walked through first class without issue. No one else was told their seat was unavailable. No one else was asked to step aside. Lisa let the moment sit before asking, "Did they ever give you a valid reason?" "No," Anaya said simply, and when I refused to accept their explanation, the tone changed. I was told to step aside so they could continue boarding. I was threatened with security. The only reason I was allowed to take my seat was because passengers were watching, because someone recorded it. Lisa leaned back slightly, and now that recording has sparked an international conversation. She gestured toward the screen behind her where headlines flashed, "Racial bias in first class," "Airline faces backlash," "Surgeon stands her ground." Anaya glanced at the images but didn't let them distract her. "The sad truth is that my experience isn't unique. It's just that this time the world was watching." Lisa hesitated for a beat, then asked the question millions were wondering. "What do you want to happen next?" Anaya exhaled slowly. "I don't want an apology crafted by a PR team. I want policies changed. I want transparency in how airlines determine seating reassignments. I want corporations to stop pretending these incidents are misunderstandings and start acknowledging the systemic biases built into their structures." Lisa nodded, clearly impressed. "And if the airline reaches out to you directly?" Anaya didn't hesitate. "They'll have to do more than just talk." The camera zoomed in slightly as she continued. "This isn't just about one flight. This is about every professional, every woman, every person of color who has been made to feel like they don't belong. We do. And it's time companies stop acting like we don't." The interview ended, but the conversation had just begun. The fallout was immediate. Within an hour of the interview airing, social media erupted with renewed fury. The airline's generic PR statement was no longer enough. Customers demanded real accountability, and hashtags calling for a boycott began trending themselves. A major travel agency publicly announced it was reconsidering its partnership with the airline. Several high-profile figures, including politicians and CEOs, issued statements condemning the airline's actions. This wasn't just a PR nightmare anymore, it was a full-scale crisis. Inside the airline's headquarters, the atmosphere was toxic with panic. The CEO, Robert Gaines, paced in front of a long table filled with senior executives, legal advisors, and the PR team. His face was red with frustration as he slammed a folder down. "This is a goddamn disaster," he snapped. "Do you know how many calls I've had in the last 24 hours? We are hemorrhaging money. If this isn't contained now, we're looking at lawsuits, lost contracts, and government scrutiny." The head of PR, a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in days, cleared her throat. "We need a new approach. The standard playbook isn't going to work this time." The legal advisor shook his head. "If we admit fault, we open ourselves up to litigation." Robert shot him. A glare. "And if we don't, we lose millions. Pick your poison." The room fell silent. The weight of the situation was undeniable now. Then a voice from the far end of the table spoke up. It was Diane Mercer, a younger executive who had been quietly observing the chaos. She leaned forward, her expression unreadable. "We need to meet with her." The room collectively turned toward her. Robert narrowed his eyes. "Meet with who?" "Dr. Patel." Diane sat up straighter. "Not in a PR damage control way. I mean, actually sit down with her, listen to her. If we want to come out of this with even a shred of credibility, we have to show that we're willing to do more than just apologize." The CEO scoffed. "You want me to beg a woman we just humiliated for mercy?" Diane didn't flinch. "No, I want us to make this right before it costs us everything." The room stayed silent for a long time. Finally, Robert exhaled, rubbing his temples. He knew she was right. They had no leverage anymore. The world was watching. "Fine," he muttered. "Set up a meeting." Across the city, Dr. Anaya Patel sat in her apartment, staring at an email that had just landed in her inbox. Subject: urgent discussion request. Airline name: leadership. She read the message once, then twice. They wanted to meet. She leaned back in her chair, fingers drumming against the desk. She wasn't sure if they were ready for this conversation, but she was. The conference room was sleek, modern, and cold. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline, but the tension inside the room was suffocating. Dr. Anaya Patel sat across from Robert Gaines, the airline's CEO, his suit crisp, but his demeanor forced. To his right sat Diane Mercer, the only executive in the room who seemed remotely open to real dialogue. Anaya folded her hands on the table, her posture relaxed, but her gaze sharp. "Let's be clear," she said. "I didn't come here for a PR stunt. If that's what this is, I'll walk out right now." Robert exhaled through his nose, clearly not used to being put on the defensive. "We want to make this right," he said, voice clipped. Anaya arched an eyebrow. "Do you?" Diane interjected quickly. "Dr. Patel, I understand why you're skeptical, but we're not just here to apologize. We're here to talk about what real change looks like." Anaya leaned back in her chair, studying them. "Change," she repeated. "That's a big word for a company that tried to erase me from my own seat." Robert stiffened, but Diane gave him a warning glance before turning back to Anaya. "We know we failed you, but what happened to you wasn't just an isolated mistake. It exposed a larger systemic issue. We need to address that, and we're willing to listen." Anaya tapped her fingers against the table, considering. "Then here's what I want," she said. "First, public accountability, no vague PR statements. A real transparent admission of what happened and how you plan to fix it." Robert shifted uncomfortably, but Diane nodded. "Go on." "Second, I want a full internal review of your booking and reassignment policies. How often are passengers of color being adjusted out of their seats? What patterns exist? You need to investigate that." Robert let out a breath like he was holding back an argument. "And what would that solve?" Anaya didn't miss a beat. "It would force you to acknowledge that this isn't a one-time incident. It's a pattern, and patterns don't change unless they're exposed." Diane scribbled notes. "And third," Anaya's eyes didn't waver, "I want you to commit to policy reform. New training for your employees, clear anti-bias protocols, and an external oversight committee to ensure this doesn't happen again." Robert's jaw tightened. "That's a lot to ask." Anaya tilted her head. "No, it's the bare minimum. The only reason you're sitting here is because this time you got caught. Next time, you might not be so lucky." At Robert, then back at Anaya. "If we agree to these terms, would you be willing to consult on the reforms?" Anaya studied them both for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "If you're serious about real change, yes." Robert exhaled. He wasn't happy, but he knew he had no choice. "Fine," he muttered. "Let's get to work." The announcement came 2 weeks later. It wasn't buried in a press release or hidden behind vague corporate jargon. It was bold, direct, and impossible to ignore. The airline released a public statement acknowledging their failures, detailing their commitment to systemic reform, and outlining the new policies they were implementing. For the first time in its history, the airline admitted that racial and gender biases had played a role in passenger treatment. They announced the creation of an independent oversight board, the introduction of bias training for all employees, and a complete audit of passenger reassignment policies. And at the heart of it all, Dr. Anaya Patel's name was attached, not as a victim, but as a consultant leading the change. The reaction was immediate. Some people were skeptical, dismissing the airline's actions as damage control. Others saw it for what it was: a corporation forced to reckon with its own shortcomings, finally held accountable in a way that only public pressure had made possible. But to Anaya, it was more than just a corporate decision. It was proof that speaking up mattered. Sitting in a conference room weeks later, reviewing the first drafts of the new training modules, she realized something. She had never wanted to be an activist. She had spent her entire life fighting for space in the medical world, proving herself over and over again, saving lives. And yet, in that moment at the airport, she had been forced into another battle she never asked for. But she had fought anyway, because the truth was, this wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had been ignored, dismissed, pushed aside because of what they looked like or where they came from. The door to the conference room opened, and Diane Mercer stepped in, holding a fresh stack of documents. "I just got off the call with legal," she said. "They're finalizing the contracts for the oversight board." Anaya nodded, flipping through the paperwork in front of her. "Good. No loopholes, no vague wording." "This only works if it's real," Diane smiled. "You're relentless." "I have to be," Anaya said simply. A moment passed, then Diane tilted her head. "You know, you didn't have to do this. You could have walked away, let the outrage burn out, gone back to your life." Anaya exhaled, thinking about that moment at the gate, the way they had dismissed her so easily, like she had no right to exist in that space. "I could have," she admitted. "But then nothing would have changed." Diane studied her for a beat before nodding. "Well, whether you planned for it or not, you're leading a movement." Anaya glanced at the documents again, at the policies that were about to reshape an industry. Maybe she was. Dr. Anaya Patel stepped onto the jet bridge, her carry-on rolling smoothly behind her. The familiar scent of recycled air filled her lungs as she entered the plane, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the quiet weight of hesitation pressing down on her chest. She handed her first-class boarding pass to the flight attendant, who glanced at it, then looked up with a smile. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Patel," she said warmly. Anaya gave a small nod and walked forward, taking her seat near the front of the cabin. The leather was soft, the space wide and comfortable, but that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that she belonged here, not because of the seat itself, but because she had fought for this moment, for every person who had been told, subtly or blatantly, that they didn't. A few minutes later, another passenger slid into the seat beside her. A young woman, maybe in her mid-20s, dressed in business attire, her curls bouncing as she settled in. She glanced at Anaya, did a double take, then blinked in clear recognition. "You're Dr. Patel," the woman said, her voice hushed but filled with something close to awe. Anaya turned, offering a polite but curious smile. "Yes, I am." The woman hesitated for half a second before leaning in slightly. "I saw the video," she admitted. "I watched the interviews. I even followed the airline's new policy rollout because of you." Anaya's expression softened. The woman exhaled a quiet laugh, almost in disbelief. "I travel for work a lot, and I mean, I've had moments like that too. Not exactly the same, but close. The difference is I never spoke up. I just swallowed it and moved on." Anaya studied her, seeing the layers of unspoken experiences in the younger woman's eyes. "I used to do that too," she said after a pause. "For years." The woman nodded. "But now you don't." Anaya smiled slightly. Silence passed between them, filled with quiet understanding. The flight attendant came by, offering pre-departure drinks. As Anaya took her glass of water, she glanced around the cabin. It looked the same as it always had. Plush seats, hushed tones, the quiet luxury of first class. But something was different. Not in the physical space, but in the shift that had already begun, in the conversations that had been forced to happen, in the quiet but significant acknowledgement that things were changing. The young woman beside her took a breath. "I think the world needed someone like you to remind us that we don't have to just accept it." Anaya looked out the window as the plane taxied down the runway, the engines humming beneath them. "Maybe," she said, and as the plane lifted into the sky, she knew that this too was only the beginning.